Good afternoon. I want to thank all of you for attending today's lecture, Ethics in the Age of Partisan Warfare, an exploration of past debates for ethics, as well as the push for new oversight and enforcement on the heels of growing allegations of sexual misconduct in the United States Congress. I'm Sheryl, Vogt, Director of the Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and to introduce our guest lecturer today, Dr. Julian Zelizer. First, let me take a moment to thank our partners in this event. A huge thank you goes to the Richard B. Russell Foundation. The programming endowment that they created for the Russell Library allowed us to bring Dr. Zelizer to campus today. And a thank you also to our campus partners, the School for Public and International Affairs and the Department of History, who also provided funding to support today's lecture, as well as our ongoing Civic Knowledge, Civic Power series, a weekly lunch and learn events hosted each Tuesday in April, where professors from UGA's Department of Political Science treat attendees to short lectures and informal discussion about the powers and function of the U.S. Congress. As a founding member of the Association of Centers for the Study of Congress, the Russell Library created these events as a way to promote a better public understanding of Congress as the branch of government closest to the public. To learn more about upcoming events, please visit the Russell Library blog or pick up one of our flyers on the table outside. This especially gives our events for this month. Following today's lecture, we hope that you will join us for the reception in the hallway, and also you have an opportunity to purchase some of Dr. Zelizer's more recent books. So now to the main event. Julian Zelizer is the Malcolm Stevenson Forbes, class of 1941, professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University, and he's also a CNN political analyst. He is an award-winning author and editor of 19 books on American political history, including The Fierce Urgency of Now, Lyndon Johnson, Congress, and the Battle for the Great Society, which has won the D.B. Hardman Prize for the best book on U.S. Congress. Zelizer is a popular commentator for television, radio, and print. He has published over 700 op-eds, including his regular columns for CNN.com and in The Atlantic. He just published an edited collection entitled The Presidency of Barack Obama, a First Historical Assessment. He is working on 3 other books, including a history of the scandal that brought down Speaker Jim Wright, a history of the United States since 1974, which is being co-authored with Kevin Cruz, and a biography of Rabbi Abraham Heschel. He has received fellowships from the New York Historical Society, the Guggenheim Foundation, Russell Sage, New America, and the Brookings Institution. Dr. Zelizer.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. Thanks to everyone who made this possible, the Russell Library, the School of Public and International Affairs, the Department of History. I have heard great things about Athens. I had not been here, so it's really a pleasure just to walk around this afternoon and to see the university. We live in a moment when public distrust for Congress is incredibly strong. Polls consistently show that the public does not think much of representatives or our senators. Skepticism in Congress to do the right thing or to be trusted to do the right thing runs very high. And the constant political polarization in the institution makes it seem incapable of handling any of the nation's major issues. Even at a moment when the public thinks poorly of the President of the United States, one thing the President always has going for him is that the country doesn't think much of Congress either. The average polls, according to Real Clear Politics, show approval ratings for Congress hovering around 16 or 17%. Other than car salespeople who receive lower ratings than Congress, legislators fall lower than advertising practitioners, stockbrokers, insurance salesmen, and many others. With no offense to those professions, that's how the rankings fall. This is nothing new, of course. Mark Twain once joked it could probably be shown by facts and figures that there is no distinctly American criminal class except Congress. Writing in Politico, John Bresnahan and Rachel Bade wrote that, quote, "The past year in Congress has been a low-light reel of nonstop, unethical, and in some cases potentially illegal behavior. 3 House members resigned over alleged misconduct. 4 others announced they won't seek re-election, an option that they took to head off party leaders, forcing them out." The authors go on to say, quote, "Incidents like these have become increasingly routine, which itself shows how far Congress's ethical standards have fallen lately." It's clear to many that congressional ethics seem to have fallen by the wayside, even though legislators now live under rules that are much more stringent than what their predecessors faced, with rules limiting outside income and honoraria, rules limiting interaction with lobbyists, and rules limiting what staffers can do when they leave Capitol Hill. Very few people seem to think that that's the case. The image is that Congress is full of campaign money-seeking politicians who spend most of their time raising campaign funds and cutting deals with lobbyists rather than fulfilling the democratic will. Although the smoke-filled rooms may be gone, the images of unethical, unscrupulous legislators still remain front and center. This is a great disappointment for many of the politicians who came of age in the 1970s, a moment when reformers worked very hard in the aftermath of the Watergate scandal to change the way that Congress worked. Although today this decade is often discussed, the 1970s, as the moment we started to become more partisan, it was also a decade when a window for political reform opened up. And there was a lot of effort to change the way that our political institutions worked. In the aftermath of Vietnam and Watergate, a young generation of reformers came to Congress prepared to make certain that the old ways of doing business did not persist. They struggled to bring an end to the committee-era Congress that had been dominated by Southern Democrats such as Senator Russell. That meant disempowering autonomous committee chairs who dominated Congress from the late 1930s through the early 1970s, which had been a bipartisan coalition of Southern Democrats and Midwestern Republicans who had stifled many liberal initiatives that had been pushed by presidents from Roosevelt to Johnson, other than a few exceptional moments like 1965. The reforms of the 1970s meant that more of Congress would be open to public scrutiny and to the media. Sunshine rules ensured that deliberations would be accessible to the press and sometimes to citizens who wanted to watch. Party reforms meant that Democratic and Republican Party leaders would have more tools to make sure that members of their caucus voted the right way. Votes were going to be recorded after the 1970s so that nobody could hide in the shadows on key issues. The Watergate babies in 1975 voted to remove several senior legislators from their committee posts for having refused to listen to younger members. And the Watergate babies, by doing that, sent a strong signal to all of the leaders that they needed to be responsive to the rank and file. Senior Democrats were stunned in the mid-70s as they saw all these reforms unfold. When asked how this could happen, Carl Albert shook his head and just said, I don't know. John Lawrence, former chief of staff for Speaker Nancy Pelosi, has just written a wonderful book about the class of 1974, if you're interested in their story. Ethics was one area where the reformers attempted to make progress. The Congressional Ethics Committees had been products of the 1960s. The Senate Ethics Committee was created in 1964 in the aftermath of a scandal involving Bobby Baker. And the House established an Ethics Committee in 1967, in part a response to a scandal that involved New York Congressman Adam Clayton Powell. Lyndon Johnson's right-hand man, Baker, had been involved in a number of controversial issues and deals involving lobbyists and money that gave rise to increased demand to do something about the ethical behavior of members. Until this time, Congress had made most decisions about ethics on an ad hoc basis. As Senate historian Richard Baker wrote, for nearly 2 centuries, a simple and informal code had existed. Prevailing norms of general decency served as the chief determinants of proper legislative conduct, he wrote. Congress had chosen to deal on a case-by-case basis only with the most obvious acts of wrongdoing, those that were clearly inconsistent with the trust and duty of a member. But then, in the mid-1970s, the ethics rules were tightened pretty significantly. At that point, Congress ranked already beneath 8 other institutions, major institutions in terms of ethics. According to a Harris survey, the public believed that there were higher ethical standards in the mid-1970s, even though Congress was pretty much at a peak of its popularity as a result of the Watergate hearings. There were higher ethical standards, the public said, in news, the White House, state government, state legislative branches, and the courts. The only group under Congress were corporate executives and labor leaders, which said a lot because the poll was taken at the height of the stagflation and economic crisis of the 1970s. The new Code of Ethics, adopted by the House and Senate in 1977 and 78, mandated disclosure and financial information about members, prohibited the use of secret office accounts, slush funds of money that members could use for whatever they wanted, and limited the amount of outside income that a member of Congress could earn, giving talks or earning various kind of honoraria. In the House of Representatives, Wisconsin Congressman David Obey headed a commission that basically framed and set up the regulations that were adopted. Based on interviews with 150 members and staff, the commission released its findings in September of '77, and when the commission presented its findings to the House, Speaker Tip O'Neill, realizing that it was not the moment to resist reform, warned, if you want to kill this, the onus is on your own, because if these rules go down the drain, I see no future in the ethics of Congress. The Senate also imposed similar types of restriction. Despite the changes, though, initially, the Ethics Committee were both, in the House and Senate, very reluctant to go after fellow members of Congress. This was always a problem. John Flint from Georgia, who was the chair of the House Ethics Committee, was notorious for doing almost nothing when ethics cases came his way. Flint acknowledged he didn't really like the job. It's never pleasant or enjoyable, he said, to sit in judgment of one's friends. The joke on Capitol Hill was that the best way to kill ethics complaint was to send it to the Ethics Committee. And there was some truth to that. There was a built-in system where members were being asked to pass judgment on their colleagues, and many members didn't want to do that. When Newt Gingrich launched his second campaign for Congress in 1978, he made John Flint, who was the incumbent, a symbol of the corruption of the Democratic Party and the failure to take these issues seriously. It is possible to look at the history of Congress and see that ethics regulations were always limited. But I do think that the rules and the oversight made a difference. The question is not so much, can Congress ever take steps to curb the ethical problems that the institution faces. But why, since the 1970s, did that moment of reform erode? Why did the effort to actually improve what was required of members seem to have broken down? What happened to the optimism of the late 1970s that the system could be made better? So I want to talk about two problems that I think confronted congressional ethics since the 1970s and undermined some of the ability of Congress to enforce these rules, but also to continue improving itself. The first will have to do with the convergence of partisanship and ethics, and the second has to do with the resistance of Congress, particularly on questions of sexual harassment, in ceding any kind of control to other institutions to regulate how Congress worked. The convergence of partisan polarization and the post-Watergate reforms was one of the reasons that ethics lost a lot of legitimacy in the minds both of the public and members of Congress. The problem was that the committee started to finally look at ethics issues and take ethics rules more seriously right as we entered the period we now live in of intense partisan polarization. This is a dynamic many people have written about, I'm sure all of you have read about in some capacity, where there's a declining center on Capitol Hill and members of each party have moved further and further apart. The intensity of partisan combat between the Democrats and the Republicans during this period has increased significantly. Scandal became one of the mechanisms through which the parties went after each other. Congressman Newt Gingrich, back to him, was one of the first people to see this relationship and to capitalize on the potential of using the 1970s reforms as a tool of partisan combat. And I think this was a real important development. A key moment that I'm now working on for one of the books that you just heard about comes with the downfall of Speaker of the House Jim Wright in 1989, who was forced to resign or pressured to resign because of alleged ethics violation. Wright had just become Speaker of the House in 1987 when Tip O'Neill retired from Congress. And Newt Gingrich was a young Republican known as a bomb thrower and a renegade who had just entered in 1978, filling John Flint's seat when he retired. Gingrich had made, as you heard in that earlier quote, congressional corruption a central theme from the time that he started running. During a speech to the young Republicans in Fulton County back in 1976, Gingrich, for example, warned, quote, "The news media continues to uncover more and more congressional corruption every day. We have seen padded payrolls and falsified travel vouchers, bribery and forgery, all by the men we elect to pass our laws and lead this country, and all by powerful members of the Democratic Party." Gingrich won his seat in 1978, replacing Flint, and then he started to make corruption a theme for the entire party. He argued to fellow Republicans that the only way they would finally become a majority, Republicans hadn't controlled the House since 1954, was by tapping into the anti-establishment sentiment that existed in the electorate after Vietnam and after Watergate, and focusing on that issue, bringing down the establishment, rather than on a left-right debate over specific issues. The key message for Gingrich was that the Democratic majority had been in power since 1954, not because they were popular, but because they abused their authority, they built fiefdoms of privilege, and they prevented the minority party from participating in deliberations. He formed a caucus called the Congressional Opportunity Society in 1983, which made these themes central. Gingrich had found someone who was a perfect target when Jim Wright took over as Speaker in 1987, and Tip O'Neill retired. Looking at newspaper articles from the Texas papers, as well as a few in the national press, Gingrich picked up on a number of stories about Wright's relationship to business people in Fort Worth, including a real estate developer with whom Wright had a close relationship, and financial interactions that they had made that looked a bit murky. Gingrich used the ethics rules, such as the rule limiting the amount of honoraria that a member of Congress could earn speaking and doing outside events, and argued that Wright had circumvented those rules through all kinds of tricks. The big story, for those of you who remember this scandal, was that Wright, who could only earn a certain amount speaking, had figured out that he could sell as many books as he wanted because the ethics rules didn't limit income book royalties. So when Wright would speak to large trade groups, he insisted that instead of receiving honoraria, they would sell tons of his books in bulk, and he could make the money. And so Gingrich picked up on this. Wright responded that the ethics rules didn't, in fact, cover that, and many members of Congress sold their books, but it became a centerpiece of Gingrich's campaign. Gingrich also honed in on Wright's relationship with a real estate developer named George Mallock in Fort Worth to create intense pressure on Wright by 1989 to bring him down from power. In May of 1989, the strategy worked. Many Democrats were furious about what was happening, believing that Gingrich was skewing the facts and blowing small issues out of proportion to essentially mount a coup against the Democratic Party. But regardless of what people thought, it was effective. When Wright stepped down at the end of May in 1989, warning his colleagues to avoid a period of mindless cannibalism, ethics has never been the same since that moment in Capitol Hill. 10 years later, by the way, Gingrich himself would fall to ethics charges as the House fined him $300,000 for his actions when he violated tax rules through a tax-exempt class that turned out to be partisan propaganda. Other members of Congress also started to fall. The other famous case of a big powerhouse falling in the early 1990s was Dan Rostenkowski, the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, who was another member caught living by the old rules in the post-Watergate period when the rules had changed. Rostenkowski's problems began with an investigation by Jay Stevens, a Reagan-appointed U.S. attorney, into the House Post Office, a haven of political patronage. Rostenkowski would be indicted for corruption on May 30th, 1994, one of the most powerful members of Congress, for 17 counts of misusing public funds, including purchasing books at the House stationery store for constituents, padding the payroll by hiring friends, and selling stamps for cash. The U.S. attorney who presented the case to the grand jury, a man named Eric Holder, told reporters, as in Eric Holder, future attorney general, the allegations contained in today's indictment represent a betrayal of the public trust for personal gain. In essence, he said, this indictment alleges that Congressman Rostenkowski used his elective office to perpetuate an extensive fraud on the American people. Rostenkowski refused to plead guilty. Democrats forced him to resign as chairman. He had a 2-year trial during which he lost his seat and eventually pled guilty to lesser charges in '96 and spent some time in jail. The issue of ethics didn't go away. Although there have been many serious ethics investigations that would continue to produce wrongdoing, ethics simply became more implicated in the partisan wars of Washington, D.C. The last big moment of ethics took place in 2006 when the Republican majority on Capitol Hill was brought down in part because of a new round of ethics allegations, ranging from communications with pages, sexual communications with pages, to the relationship between the Republican majority and lobbyists like Jack Abramoff. The allegations were serious and legitimate, but they took place in the middle of a midterm campaign, and they produced some pretty big results, leading to the Democrats controlling Congress. In 2008, Congress responded to the last round of these scandals by creating an Office of Congressional Ethics, which is the most independent check that we've had on the legislative branch, though it didn't receive subpoena power. But in general, ethics and partisanship, by the period in which we are living, go hand in hand. And there's less of a sense that ethics can be handled separately and outside the political process. The indictments and scandals that Gingrich used to bring down Wright became pillars in his efforts to build a Republican majority, and the effects have been felt ever since. A second problem in terms of dealing with ethics since the 1970s has been the reluctance of Congress to delegate any kind of authority to anyone else to handle these matters. And this goes back to the joke about the Ethics Committee being the place where you can bury an ethics complaint. Central has always been the idea that Congress needed, for constitutional reasons, to retain control over these kinds of issues. And nowhere has the problem with this logic been clearer than with the question of sexual harassment, which is the ethics issue that has been front and center over the past year. There was general anticipation that Congress would finally do something about these ethics questions after a series of events in 1991 and 92 had brought these to the forefront of national attention. Some experts predicted that it was as a result of a number of stories, as well as multiple scandals that were coming out of the private sector, 92, just as some are predicting today, would be the year of the woman. But 1992 and 1993 and 1994 actually turned out to be a year or years of missed opportunities to do something about this series of ethics problems. The missed opportunity of the 90s started in October of 1991, when during the Senate confirmation hearings for Clarence Thomas, President George H.W. Bush's nominee for the Supreme Court, the public saw how little sensitivity there was on Capitol Hill to the challenges that women faced at the workplace. During the hearings, the news, NPR in particular, broke the story that there were allegations against Clarence Thomas by Anita Hill, who had worked for him when he headed the EEOC, and she claimed that he had sexually harassed her, created a sexually hostile work environment. She was an African-American law professor at the University of Oklahoma, and again had worked for him when he headed the EEOC for Ronald Reagan. Her testimony was pretty shocking. After a brief discussion of work, she told the committee he would turn the conversation to a discussion of sexual matters. She told Congress his conversations were vivid. He spoke about the facts that he had seen pornographic films with me, and went into a lot of detail about what that was about. What struck many observers was how hard it was for the senators on the committee to take these allegations seriously. Wyoming Republican Alan Simpson, his response to these revelations was, if what you say this man said to you actually occurred, why in God's name, when he left his position of power or status or authority over you, and you left in 1983, why in God's name, he said, would you never speak up? Would you ever speak to a man like that the rest of your life? When she tried to explain she was concerned about her professional future and reminded the senator that it was not uncommon in cases of harassment for communication to continue, he simply said he simply found it incredible that they still spoke. Democrats such as Senator Joe Biden, the chairman of the committee, did try to bring the hearings under control when Hill came under attack, but he too wasn't particularly sensitive to the issue that had been raised. The handful of female legislators in the Senate attacked and criticized the behavior of male colleagues as these hearings unfolded, who still constituted about 98% of the upper chamber. They vowed to change the culture of Congress, and they worked to recruit a large number of female candidates for the 1992 election. When there were 4 victorious female candidates, Pat Murray, Carol Moseley Braun, Dianne Feinstein, and Barbara Boxer in the Senate elections, while Maryland's Barbara Mikulski won re-election, and a significant surge in the House and in state legislative elections, the media dubbed 1992 the Year of the Woman. That was a moment when things should have improved. 3 female legislators brought a huge number of issues to the table, and their presence as elected officials had an impact on the kind of behavior that would be deemed permissible, certainly in public settings of committee hearings and in the congressional dining hall. The ultimate victory would come in 2007 when Nancy Pelosi became the first female Speaker of the House. Yet when it came to Congress and the workplace, the accomplishments were very limited. The nub of the problem was that unlike the executive branch, there had not been civil service protections on Capitol Hill. Congress had resisted any kind of institutional infringement of its prerogatives based on claims of the constitutional separation of power. Ohio Democratic Senator John Glenn and others called Capitol Hill the last plantation as a result of these kind of workplace exemptions. His original reference was congressional insulation to the civil rights laws, but by the 1990s it was being applied to gender relations as well. The independent management of members' offices, which has also been a sacrosanct principle in the House and the Senate, prevented any kind of serious centralized oversight of members and their staff. Beneath these constitutional and managerial issues has been the ongoing fear, especially in the post-Newt Gingrich era, that any kind of stringent rules would merely become weapons in politically motivated attacks using employees to smear members of Congress. Unexpected momentum to change the status quo took place in 1995 after Republicans took control of Congress. Although many Republicans had been resistant when there were efforts to pass legislation creating more stringent rules regarding sexual behavior on the Hill, under Speaker Newt Gingrich, the GOP decided to actually take on the issue. Extending civil rights and workplace protection laws to the congressional labor force had been one of the promises that many Republican candidates in 1994 had made on the campaign trail when they said that they wanted to transform the way that Congress worked. Republicans were eager to demonstrate that they could take this issue seriously, in part because they were reeling from a scandal of their own. Oregon Republican Bob Packwood, a champion of women's rights issues, was found to be guilty of sexual misconduct. News stories and investigation by the Senate Ethics Committee had provided the public with more shocking detail about the senator grabbing women by the hair and reaching down underneath their clothes. With Republicans like Mitch McConnell speaking out about what the committee was finding, there were predictions that the Senate might vote to expel him, a pretty stringent measure, by 2/3 of a vote when the investigation was done. To demonstrate that they were serious, Republicans took the issue up as soon as the new session started. Within a few weeks, the House and Senate passed the Congressional Accountability Act of 1995 by huge bipartisan margins. The new law applied 13 federal labor and anti-discrimination rules to Congress. The legislation established an Office of Compliance under the control of Congress to handle employment cases as they arose. The measure enabled the over 30,000 workers on Capitol Hill to make claims in federal court following mediation and following counseling that would be handled through this office. Republican Christopher Shays of Connecticut, who co-sponsored the bill, he explained that, quote, if a law is right for the private sector, it's right for Congress. Democrat Joe Lieberman of Connecticut called it the golden rule, since Congress would do unto others Congress would do to ourselves as we have done unto others. The only dissenting voice when the legislation passed came from West Virginia Democrat Robert Byrd, who said that even this went too far in subjecting Congress to some kind of oversight. The proponents reminded Byrd that the Office of Compliance, which would have control over the process, would prevent that. When President Clinton signed the bill into law, he proclaimed, quote, it's about time that Congress lived by the same laws it places on the private sector. There were many employees on Capitol Hill who were skeptical at the time that the law was really going to change anything. The old-timers had heard about reform in previous era, including on financial ethics, only to see legislators exempt themselves from serious punishment. Eddie Moore, who was a janitor who worked in the Capitol, told the New York Times, nothing's really changed and nothing's likely to change. After all, this is still Congress. And he was right. The most important problem with the legislation was that even with the creation of that office, Congress continued to maintain a constitutional barrier to external oversight. By continuing to abide by this principle on these employment issues, it virtually guaranteed that enforcement of the laws would be toothless. The EEOC, for instance, would have no authority to influence how legislators handle workplace behavior and sexual harassment. The Office of Compliance, which had a settlements and award fund to pay out settlements, was in fact more of a way for Congress and members to protect themselves than a way to regulate them. Congress once again is elected to police itself, wrote Robert Turner, who's a conservative legal expert who had been an advisor to Senator Robert Griffin. The other problem was the manner through which the Office of Compliance handled cases that emerged. The office didn't provide anything comparable to the human resources departments that you find in most private sector institutions. There was very little accountability, very little transparency, even when the office paid out, as we're now learning, pretty significant settlements to people who had accused members of sexual harassment. The new process created a 30-day cooling off period where they had to continue to work on the issue while being counseled about workplace rights. Then there was a 15-day waiting period during which to decide whether someone accusing a member still wanted to go to mediation. If the accuser chose mediation, they then had to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Mediation would then last 30 more days. When that period ended, there would be 30 more days for a cooling off period before a worker could then file a complaint. After this very long and Byzantine process, a formal settlement paid through taxpayer money required the signature of a non-disclosure agreement. There would be little information about how the process worked or the cases it dealt with. Legislators would end up being shielded from the political fallout. It was a system set up in 1995, California Democrat Jackie Spear recently complained, to actually protect the harasser. We say zero tolerance, but I don't believe that we put our money where our mouths are. In a 2016 survey by Congressional Quarterly, 4 out of 10 women reported that they saw sexual harassment as a serious problem in Congress, while 1 in 6 reported having been personally victimized. Other parts of the ethics system in recent years has been under attack. The Office of Congressional Ethics, which was again created in 2008, the House Republicans in 2017 voted to place that office under the control of the Ethics Committee and to prevent them from releasing any statements about investigations they were conducting. The House Republicans eventually reversed themselves after coming under intense public criticism, but the vote indicated the fragility of these ethics rules and their standing on Capitol Hill. So this is the story of congressional ethics. It's both a story of genuine efforts to change the status quo through institutional reform back in the 1960s and 70s, which led to the creation of ethics committees, which led to the codification and recodification of rules, as well as the lost opportunities that the nation had to make sure that these reforms transformed the institution and rebuilt confidence in our Congress. Partisanship and the refusal of Congress to cede any authority over the way it worked ultimately undercut a lot of what the reformers hoped to achieve and brings us many of the problems that we have today. This doesn't mean that we can't try again. And it seems in many ways more urgent than ever before that we do something about the various ethical problems that we read about and learn about on Capitol Hill. The declining confidence in Congress that we have seen since the 1970s is a major problem, and many would argue it is a very big problem at a moment when a president is so aggressively exercising presidential power. There are ways we can make things better, even if we didn't do what we hoped to achieve several decades ago. Ethics and political ethics, both in Congress and with presidents, can't be seen only as a secondary matter. It has to be front and center. We need a Congress that the public can have confidence in. We need legislators who the public can trust, who can trust each other, and who can ultimately be trusted to do the right thing for the republic. Thank you very much. So I'm happy to take questions, comments on this, or anything related to American politics today. So, including the president. Yes.
So I have a question. You ended with that point of how we got there,
Mm-hmm.
and all the negatives go along with it. So do you have any prescriptions for how you think they might move forward? What kind of reform it would require, and if it's truly possible?
I mean, I do think one thing Congress needs to do is revisit these ethics rules that were created in the 1970s. I think that would be a concrete way to deal with it. We have a code of ethics, and I was just on your radio show today, on the radio station here, saying we should remember, and I say it here too, that it's not as if Congress never deals with this. The rules we have now are much more stringent than members faced in the 30s or 40s. You can't do a lot of things that were once commonplace. You couldn't earn as much money as you wanted, getting paid from various interest groups, personal money and campaign money. You can't get away with that. So the best and most concrete, I think, steps Congress could take right now are hearings and some kind of commission study into the ethics codes that were created back in 77 and 78, revisiting them, revising them, updating them to the realities of modern campaigning. I mean, one of the most striking things on every visit to Capitol Hill that I've had and when I meet members in both parties is how much they hate what they call talk time. Talk time is when you call people to raise money for your campaign, and most members say that's 70% of our time. Is that so? So there is this area of money and politics, which is a problem. it's related to this ethics question. And I think, we're going to reach a point where this has to be addressed. And how can we create rules that curb some of the pressure members face, curb some of the influence that interest groups have because of the money they give, and then kind of update those codes for the realities of modern life. I don't know this. I mean, you'd literally need a study of how social media, for example, has created new kinds of problems. How do you tighten the kind of revolving door world that still exists? And I think that's a very concrete way in which things can happen. Obviously, right now it's hard to see it. That said, the 70s reforms happened because all the stories of corruption and conflict of interest become so grandiose that it becomes an actual issue that legislators feel they have to address politically, or they're going to suffer. And one of the ironies of the current moment, both in the executive branch and Congress, could be we might end up there, because we see what conflict of interest means on a daily basis, you can argue. And then with sexual harassment, I don't know what's going to happen. It's like, it's a little bit, my guess is, the sentiment, it's like gun control in that the status quo on that kind of issue assumes over time interest in reform fizzles. And we had earlier this year a lot of discussion of how does Congress handle the workplace, with talk about changing the way that office works, even giving the EEOC more power or some kind of external commission more power. I haven't heard much, but I think those proposals that were emerging, it's all going to be about 2018. I mean, if there is a political earthquake in November that really upsets the incumbents and the status quo, that would be the moment, especially if gender plays a role in the electorate, to revisit some of those problems. This office isn't working. The office is not sufficient. I think it's not an ambiguous call to say that. Yes, I think you were raising first, and I'll get to
Yes, sir. What role do you think the media has in highlighting these issues and bringing them to the forefront of minds of the electorate, and so they kind of push for change?
Yeah, that's a great question too. What role does the media have? A big one. And I mean, one of the problems we have today, two problems in the media, in my opinion, in terms of this, is one person consumes attention on a daily basis in a way that is hard to get other issues spoken about. And it's not some conspiracy, or it's like the rest of the nation. This is, one of the most omnipresent presidents that we've had, who's constantly generating reasons to focus on him. So I do think right now we're at a moment the media, moves forward very quickly away from some of these problems emerging. And that's a problem, because the basic point of ethics issues is that incumbents tend not to want to deal with them because they like the existing system. They have power. They're comfortable with the existing system. So the only time that changes, like in the 1970s, is when incumbents either lose power, literally, or they fear they're going to lose power if they don't do something about it. And the media is really important in making sure that these stories and these problems get proper attention. There were a lot of scandals in the mid-70s with members that really personalized what all these ethics issues were about. And then there are structural ways in which the media works that I think make it hard to get a lot of national attention. So one is simply the speed of the media, with or without a President Trump. It's just fast, and it moves from one issue to the next very quickly. And it's also a very decentralized media. We now have actually a lot of information on ethics issues in Congress or in the executive branch, but a lot of people will never see it because it's on a website that you might not go to. There's no national conversation in some ways beyond the conversation about the president. So I think it's going to be really important that journalists keep doing good work, really looking at how these ethics questions work and what kind of ideas are out there. Otherwise, the public conversation will fizzle. I think it was here, and then I'll get to you. And then I'll get here. Yes?
Can you speak to the ethical constraints of making a profit for your own business as an elected national official?
Are you thinking of anyone in particular? Look, I certainly I think that was a problem with the president that was there from the start. That was a very big ethical question. I mean, there's been so many controversies and scandals about the president, you almost have to sort through them. But in my mind, that was the big one in some ways. And it set the tone for how the administration was going to work. We didn't have anything comparable before, meaning a business person with a pretty vast business operation becoming president of the United States, and a kind of business that connected to political issues. The location of hotels overseas, property and zoning decisions in Washington, D.C. And in the end, the administration didn't decide to create a strong firewall. I don't even think you can call it a firewall, given the sons are running the business, and it's not much of a mystery for the president about these relationships. And I think it's a big problem. And I think this is what I said earlier. In some ways, the good way to look at it is maybe the fact these kinds of connections exist at the highest level of power will give attention to why this is a problem. That we don't want policy decisions skewed for the bottom line of a politician. We don't want that. That's always what ethics rules are trying to decide. We don't want a foreign policy decision made, in part because it might affect the real estate holdings of a company. But I think it's a very big problem. And I think a lot of the other scandals kind of connect to that basic conflict of interest issue with the president. My guess is some of these investigations will end up touching on those kinds of questions. Yes?
So I think diversity is very important.
Yep.
In the U.S. And what do you think how minority groups such as immigrants can serve better in the U.S. politics?
How can they serve better? I think good old-fashioned, look, the issue of increasing the diversity of Congress, there's two parts to it. One is literally the diversity of Congress. And we saw this, the civil rights movement, this is, we just kind of were thinking about the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's assassination yesterday. The next stage of the civil rights movement between the late 60s and late 70s, a lot of what it was about was mobilizing and making sure that there was more African-American political leadership at all levels of government, especially in state and local politics. And it was pretty effective. I think this was a kind of untold story of the civil rights movement. John Lewis today is in some ways the living embodiment of what the civil rights movement wanted to achieve. And it was very important because basically what you had was the institutionalization of those concerns about racial justice within the halls of power. It's the only way to make sure those issues don't dissipate or kind of fizzle over time. And I think, I don't know what will happen now, but certainly, for example, with the issue of immigration, especially with what's going on with the Dreamers, who are a very mobilized political constituency. They've been very active since the president dismantled the program. And I don't know what's going to happen right now, but it's triggered a pretty strong grassroots political response. And the question is, do they or do sympathetic groups enter into the political process through campaigns? Obviously, 2018 is the first real test, but also in state and local politics. If they do, that's the best bet to make sure that all the problems and questions and uncertainties that now exist are addressed. So I think that's the biggest. And the second is simply becoming a permanent political force. So the other kind of part of the history of civil rights isn't simply more African Americans in the 70s running for office. It's the thickening and strengthening of civil rights organizations in state capitals and in Washington, D.C., where in some ways it turns into a lobby in a good way, that the movement understands the political processes and is there on a day-to-day basis to make sure issues are addressed. Immigrant rights groups have done some of this work already. I mean, it's been for a while, but I think there's a lot more, given how the climate has changed, that probably could happen in the next few years. So I think those are the two pillars to really changing it in the halls of power. Were you raising? Someone was raising the. Okay, yes.
Do you have any idea about how Citizens United might be dismantled, or do you think there'll be a will for these movements?
Yeah, I mean, Citizens United, the thing is, it didn't cause the influx of private money into elections. So what's important in thinking of changing that decision is to get to the heart of the problem before that. The money was already coming in. So the real question is, can we look back at some of the campaign finance laws from the post-Watergate period and see how we could have a Congress put those in new forms back into place? So the public financing of elections, actually, I know it's always dismissed, but we had a system for presidential campaigns after the 74 reforms that worked for a long time. It was a pretty effective system. It really checked private money because candidates took public funds, they took limited private funds, and until the last few election cycles, it was working. And gradually, both parties abandoned it. Bush abandoned it, Obama abandoned it, and it's no longer in place. So I think Citizen United and trying to have some kind of court decision that reverses that is one way to go. But more important is to understand what are the dynamics that are, leading to this private money influx and trying to curb it. Otherwise, I think it's going to be extremely difficult. And now there's probably room for legislation for all these kind of murky spending that is going on. So it's not simply public finance anymore. There's so much spending happening in politics through essentially third parties, as we're learning on a daily basis with the 2016 election. Laws are going to have to look at social media. It's going to have to look on kind of the selling of data. I think there is room, again, if there is a moment of reform for dealing with all that, which in my mind is more important than Citizen United right now, because there's just a lot of pressure for money and other campaign problems that's building in our system. And it won't just be money. I think a story of the current investigations and scandals into 2016 is money is no longer the only issue we have to be focused on. Data is another area of campaign finance. I haven't heard any kind of real discussion of how to deal with this legislatively, how to make sure this doesn't become an expanding cancer in our political system. Yes?
Do you believe that giving congressional ethics committees the power to indict and potentially investigate ethics violations would solve problems of sexual harassment, or is it a legitimate violation of congressional power in the Constitution?
Well, the ethics committees, I think the ethics committees are always going to do limited things. I think we just have seen, especially in this era, there's limits to how far ethics committees are willing to go to punish their own members. And we are in a system that is so intensely partisan now, it's hard for me to see committees acting separate from their own partisan motivation. So I'm more of the mind that the solution isn't necessarily giving further or strengthening the power of the committees, but I'm a believer that some of this power has to go to some kind of independent body or some kind of body outside of Congress. And I understand the arguments that gets you into is Congress violating its power, but the fact is it's not as if members of Congress can do anything they want. They are subject to the rules and laws of the country. So I would be more focused on things like either the Office of Ethics or the Office of Compliance or possibly some other organizational body that it could at a minimum monitor and control these kind of complaints in a better way than has been handled. But I think too much of a focus now on stronger congressional committee power won't work. I don't think it'll fly either. But it's a good question. It's a very good question. Yeah.
So I'm reading Levitsky's and Ziblatt's book,
Yes.
Democracy's Diet, and they make a point that in the aftermath of the 1968 Democratic Convention, and also post-Watergate, they're talking about a lot of reforms to how presidential candidates were nominated.
Mm-hmm.
And their big argument is that the parties have really, their ability to gatekeep has broken down, and that's why you get people with more extreme views getting as far as they get. And I guess when you're talking about the ethical reforms in the 70s, could you just sort of broadly help us think about how those two moves might have been linked or not, to sort of open up, to make the presidential nomination process less, smoky backfilled rooms and more democratic, but relinquishing some control?
Absolutely. I mean, I just interviewed them for my podcast last week. If you want to hear it, just dropped today, Politics and Polls. And we just, with Steve, we interviewed him about the book. And it was really, we talked about that a bit. So this is a new book about how democracies break down. And they argue, I don't know if people have heard about this book, that basically we're not in an era anymore where there's coups to bring down democracies, but our institutions slowly erode. And that's what you see in various parts of the world. And that's how our democracies weaken. And kind of one of the things they have pointed to here in the U.S. is the reform you're talking on. This was the reform George McGovern was responsible for authoring within the Democratic Party, that basically ended the power of party bosses to select who the Democratic candidate was going to be for president. And we shift by 1972 to a system where primaries are the main determinant. So the effect of that is the parties lose power, and you have, as we just saw this year, a much more open-ended, or last year, a much more open-ended process where the public can move in different directions. And this opens the door for more populist voices to succeed. There's not as much of a check. The reforms in Congress, the ethics reforms, the sunshine reforms, were very similar. The whole idea was to break the power of party leaders, which at the time were these committee leaders, to end their monopoly, to end the secrecy that kind of shaped a lot of the political process in that period, and to open the doors. And the results are not that different, many people argue. The results were you have all kinds of extremists gain more power on Capitol Hill, you have more chaos, you have more uncertainty, and the parties, although partisanship is strong, no one seems to be able to control the show anymore. And all sorts of things can happen. The reason we did that, and I think, the authors are aware of this, but we forget. We did that for a reason. It wasn't as if the old system was so great. The old system where party leaders had strong authority also nurtured all kinds of problems. A lot of the public didn't know really what was happening. A lot of the public was written out of picking presidential candidates. It really didn't matter what voters cared about, and that often meant that particular parts of the party had more power. So in the 70s, when McGovern's doing this, the whole idea was Southern white Democrats had disproportionate power in the Democratic presidential process, and other voices were basically cut out. It's a trade-off. I don't have an answer. I mean, each system has its problem. The more you open things up in politics, the more you create a system without control, the more opportunities there are for bad things or unexpected things to happen. You can't control that democracy quite as effectively. But the benefits are, it is open. The benefits are, there is more opportunity for different voices, even if it's not the one you like, to gain some hold in the system. And I guess probably where people will fall is there somewhere in between? Can we rectify some of the balance? I mean, I don't particularly think our democracy, I think there's a lot of problems, and we can talk about it, including with the president, but I think our democracy is still pretty strong. And I think a lot of the changes in the 70s and the 60s, in general, were for the better. I tend to see that period as a good period. I don't agree that's the nub of our democratic institutions weakening. I think that's wrong. I actually think the reforms in general were pretty good, including the primary reforms. That doesn't mean we can't improve where we are now, that we don't have threats to how our system works, but I think it moved in the right direction. And I think we really have to remember, the reason the reforms in Congress took place and the primary system was this system we have so much nostalgia for. The pre-1970s era of bipartisanship and negotiation. This was the era where civil rights legislation was bottled up for decades, including basic legislation to end segregation. And that's why people were frustrated. Or it was a kind of system that got us into bad wars without accountability. So there were reasons we moved beyond that, and I think we can't forget that. And I don't think they're the reason we have problems. I guess I'm on a different page as I speak it out. Okay, yes?
Let's make this the last question.
Oh, okay.
We're going over.
Okay, sorry. Yeah.
Thinking about.
I can talk a lot, as you can see. Yeah.
Thinking about the public.
Yeah.
We have a sizable proportion of people, not a majority, but a large proportion that seem very accepting of flagrant ethical issues in the executive branch, as you say.
Yeah.
How do you account for that?
Well, that's perpetually true. Well, I don't know if you're asking that there's a large portion of the population that like President Trump. That's one question, or don't mind what he does. A second question is, a lot of the public knows there's problems in our system. They know there's problem with ethics. They know there's problem with money and politics. But like nothing really happens. No one does anything. They're willing to live with it. And that's always the issue of political reform. The issue is always people don't really vote on those questions. Everyone hates the way politics works. Lots of people think there's real problems from ethics to money to conflict of interest. But if you ask someone going to the ballot box how they're going to vote, it's usually bread and butter issues, the economy, foreign policy maybe. This always ranks lower. So why is that so important? Because that means with all the outrage and with all the disgust, a lot of the public not necessarily like all these issues, but they're either kind of disenchanted that anything will happen, or that's just not how they're going to vote. That's the whole paradox. People hate Congress, but they love their congressperson. It gets that. So the moments of reform, which are far and few between in American history, progressive era was another, those are the moments when that issue, reform, moves up. It's often because of a lot of scandal happening at a given moment. It's often because of the press paying attention, unusual amount of attention to these issues, or it could be other factors. But I think you're right, and I think this is the challenge. It's how do you turn this into a political moment to actually change things, given that a lot of the public either they don't mind it or they don't think there's anything they can do about it. But that is the status quo. That's the unfortunate status quo, and that's why a lot of the problems in Washington, people are to blame, not the politicians. Because if people were voting on this, if people were putting pressure on members not to take so much money, you can bet members of Congress would start voting for legislation. Because in the end, they'd want their jobs. That's just how it works. But they know that's not the case. So in the end, the blame should fall to the citizenry. And until the citizens change, until the voters change, we're not going to have momentum for reform. Thank you.